Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. There are growing indications that Washington isn't finished with Afghanistan just yet. Military involvement has come to an end, but not engagement. Also, we are told there is an energy crisis. Maybe this is part of the Great Reset. To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He's a historian, analyst, and author of the book, Arise, Russia, The Return of Russia to World Politics. And in Plymouth, we have Patrick Henningsen. He is the editor and founder of the 21stCenturyWire.com. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules. In effect, that means you can jump anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Okay, let's start out with Marcus. Ever since the chaotic withdrawal from Kabul in the Western world, particularly in the Washington foreign policy swamp, there's been a lot of discussion of what is next here, and actually what has actually happened and is happening. Because on the one hand, you have many saying, and this is the subtext is a reason to go back in, is that the Taliban are in league with ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all of this. And then there's another narrative out there that visually it was very chaotic, but policy-wise, there may be some kind of underlying attempt to engage the Taliban as some kind of barrier and even possible ally in the region when it comes to American foreign policy. It's really mixed because there's a lot of emotion attached to this, okay? How do you see it? Because there's one thing that you can't deny. A lot of military equipment was left behind.
During the Afghan Civil War, which raged from 1996 to 2001, it approximately took the Taliban then 1 year to emerge triumphant in the country. And yet in 2021, despite the presence of the US military in Afghanistan, together with the Afghan army, which was trained and abundantly equipped by Washington, it took the Taliban a matter of weeks to conquer the whole of the country. Now, anyone with just an ounce of enlightenment about military affairs will conclude that it was simply inconceivable for the Taliban on their own to have conquered Afghanistan, a country exceptionally large, exceptionally diverse, and with the American military present. That is why, Peter, leading up to the Taliban's victory in Afghanistan, and on the day they entered Kabul, I stood almost alone on television by saying that I believe the West, America, and also Britain arrived at an informal agreement with the Taliban, whereby the Americans and the British would allow the Taliban to emerge victorious, to run Afghanistan, and in return, the Taliban would have to ensure that America and Britain retain their strategic influence in Afghanistan. And what we have seen since, in fact, what we saw within days of the Taliban's entry into Kabul was meetings between the Taliban and the director of the CIA, meetings between the Taliban and the head of Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service, SIS, more commonly known as MI6. We have also seen the Taliban guarantee in public the security of Western pipelines in Afghanistan. And we have also seen Western mainstream media, both in America and in Britain, begin the process of conditioning the American and British people to seeing the Taliban as an ally against ISIS, because the Americans and the British mainstream media outlets are starting to tell their people that the Taliban are not the Taliban from the 1990s and the 2000s. They have reformed. They have even pledged to observe and respect human rights. So what I believe, Peter, is that the Americans and the British are very much in Afghanistan. They do not need an army of occupation to control Afghanistan. They have simply arrived at an informal agreement with the Taliban, and they control key institutions in Afghanistan, such as the civil service. And I believe that sooner rather than later, Washington and London will formalize their informal relations with the Taliban by reopening their embassies in Kabul.
Oh, Patrick, you jump in there, because you could also make the argument, and what we just heard can be true, but it can also be true that that the Taliban are playing the field. Of course, you have they've met with the Russians. The Russians met with them before, even though the Taliban is designated by Russia as a terrorist organization. China has chimed in as well. So it looks like the great game, it's the 21st century version of it here, because I would agree with Marcus that the U.S. wants to maintain at least some form of influence there, because it's the Taliban is reaching out to others. And we have to remind everyone, part of the Trump deal was that groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS had to be under control, meaning they wouldn't be using Afghanistan as a base for foreign endeavors here. So there's a lot of mixed commentary. Again, it's because of the emotional shock for so many people that were so vested in the war. They're going to peddle that narrative. So I think things are in flux here. But Patrick, react to what Marcus had to say, because it's very interesting.
Yeah, you could say, I'll comment on continue what Marcus's point I think can go off to and then segue. But when the early 90s, when the Taliban took power, it was a lot of people in the West don't realize that a lot of people in Afghanistan at that time saw them as the lesser of two evils, because all these warlords, Northern Alliance types that the U.S. had backed later, post 9/11, they were responsible and known throughout Afghanistan for committing grave atrocities. And so when the Taliban came to power, even by the women of Afghanistan, were seen as the lesser of two evils. So it wasn't as black and white, because the Afghan war is portrayed as a women's rights issue in the West. I mean, that was the sort of overriding narrative right through everything that justified the intervention. That's how it played out anyway, in terms of the liberal press and so forth. But the reality is much more complicated. And the point Marcus was making about the U.S. strategic interests. So the question is, what are those strategic interests? And yes, you have the TAPI, the Turkmenistan, Afghan, Pakistan, India pipeline. That's definitely a Western interest. Why is that a Western interest? Because that's in direct competition with the CPEC, Chinese Pakistan Energy Corridor, which is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So these are competing supply lines. India is a big set piece in Western geopolitical hegemony terms. And so who can win India and also cut off China to deride China? I mean, the U.S., it's known the U.S. are backing Baluchi militants, and they're attacking some of these very areas, including near the Gwadar, port of Gwadar in Pakistan. You have the militants in Myanmar. You have destabilization there. That's another route. China needs these overland routes to bypass any potential disruption in the South China Sea, a la AUKUS, and sort of the things that we're looking at that could take place in the future in terms of disrupting shipping lanes and so forth. So China has a very diverse strategy. And one of the main set pieces also is Xinjiang, Western China. And there was the ISIS, the emergence of ISIS-K is, if you look back at the history of this so-called terrorist group, okay, they've just rebranded it to ISIS-K. It was the Khorasan group in 2014, 2015. This was a term coined by the U.S. intelligence when James Clapper was in charge. This is an Obama administration, in my opinion, and probably many others who've looked at this closely. It's a kind of a construct, the Khorasan group. And the pedigree through it, Ayman Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the underwear bomber, it runs right through this bit of classic intelligence clandestine terrorist construction that the U.S. So they've just basically revived it, and all of a sudden, suicide bomb attacks after the pullout in Afghanistan. So what is an ISIS faction doing in Afghanistan but playing a disruptive role? You just had all the Uyghurs escaping from prison magically after the U.S. withdrew. You have all these other ISIS militants who were somehow simultaneously escaped from prison. I'm sure they had assistance in that. So that's the major jihadi jailbreak that you saw right before the emergence of ISIS in July of 2014. So I see this repeating pattern that's forming right now. And so like you said, the U.S. doesn't need to be in Afghanistan militarily, like Marcus said. And there's other things that they can do to direct the affairs in the region.
Well, it sounds like, Marcus, it sounds like to me is that, in Western historical constructs, we go from this state to this state here. But I mean, given what we've already said here on our program, is that this is just a continuation of the Civil War, just in a different direction with different people with different names. Because it sounds like this is what's going on right here. Go ahead, Marcus.
Yes, and I also believe that history teaches us that the Americans and the British only withdraw from a country of strategic value to them if they have been militarily defeated in that country. And the Americans and the British were not militarily defeated in Afghanistan. It is true, the Americans and the British were never able to militarily inflict a defeat on the Taliban, but at the same time, the Taliban were never able to defeat the Americans and the British. Indeed.
Marcus, also, is that another failure is that the U.S. was never able to legitimize their proxy government in the eyes of the population. That was a very key thing. And I think fundamentally that is the reason why they decided to leave, okay? Because there was nothing you could do to legitimize that government. It was just corrupt to the core. Keep going.
Indeed. And if we have a look at the casualties which the American and British militaries incurred in Afghanistan, the losses were almost negligible. So that is why it comes back to my assertion, which I have been putting out for some months now, that the Americans and the British had no reason to leave Afghanistan. Afghanistan is of immense strategic value to both Washington and London, as it was to the British Empire in the 19th century. So that is why I believe we will see that through the Taliban, the Americans and the British will attempt to threaten Russian national security through Central Asia, because of course Central Asia is Russia's backyard, so to speak. Through the Taliban, the Americans and the British will continue to try and destabilize Xinjiang, which is, of course, a restless Muslim province in China. And also through the Taliban, the Americans and the British will be able to limit Iran's influence in the region.
We've got a lot more to talk about when it comes to Afghanistan in the future. Gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with RT.
I look forward to talking to you all.
That technology should work for people.
A robot must obey the orders given it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law.
Show your identification.
We should be very careful about artificial intelligence.
The point, obviously, is to create trust rather than fear.
I would like to take on various jobs.
I mean, with artificial intelligence, we are summoning the demon.
A robot must protect its own existence.
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. This is the home edition. To remind you, we're discussing some real issues. Okay, gentlemen, let's change gears here. Patrick, the Western world, the world in general, is experiencing a quote-unquote energy crisis here. In many ways, for me, certainly consumers are feeling it, a shortage, high prices. There's no denying that. But the cause of it, well, that's a different issue altogether. And I sum it up with just two ideas, rank incompetence and ideology. I'll explain later. Go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, so it's funny how the press has reported this energy shock, price shock, and it's seen as like some active nature. It's just some organic event that just happened, and we all have to deal with this record surge in wholesale energy prices. And the reality is that this isn't an organic act of God. This is a direct result of government policies, specific policy decisions made by the governments of Europe, made by Great Britain, made by the United States and other G7 countries included. Okay, so their willingness to go along with this Green New Deal, mainly ideologically driven directive, and we saw the results of it last winter in Germany when the wind turbines froze, when there was no solar power, when they couldn't meet their baseload demand. What did they do? They fired up the...
Same thing in Texas. Keep going.
Yes, they fired up the coal plants. So now what do you see? You see coal's coming back. Now they have to do this again. What's happened to the price of coal? It's surged. What does that mean? They need to buy carbon credits or carbon offsets. So the carbon markets are booming because of a restriction in supply to the energy market. So what's the result of this? Fossil fuels becoming expensive. This price is being passed on to consumers. Okay, but what's really caused this? This started during the Enron revolution. The total deregulation and free floating of wholesale prices, derivative markets were introduced for energy. The speculation industry was basically opened up. And although Enron collapsed and people were arrested and charges were brought, the system still remains. So you can manipulate the energy market. Then you add to this the price of gas, because if Russia was allowed to supply via the Nord Stream 2, via other pipeline projects, it would help to stabilize the spot price. And so they're blaming Russia, accusing Putin of weaponizing energy. It's unbelievable. So Russia just wants to be a good partner to Europe, provide constant, cheap, and stable natural gas.
And Marcus, the amazing thing is, I've been following the Russian energy markets for donkey years. I mean, a long time. And one thing that they've always stressed, and Gazprom has always said, because that's the monopoly exporter for Russia, is that they want long-term contracts. They want to stay away from this speculation, and that's what it all is. Exactly what Patrick was saying right here. This is for some people, a one person's crisis is a small group of wealthy people's opportunity here. And again, the incompetence of it, okay, when we had the height of the lockdown in the West, okay, obviously consumption went down, and then, they didn't fill up the storage units, and then when the lockdown started to come to an end, there was a surge in demand, and while during that same time, they should have been refilling the storage units, but they weren't, okay? I mean, just incompetent. I mean, I don't even work in that industry, and I know that. Go ahead, Marcus.
Firstly, in the UK, energy prices rise year on year, not because of Brexit, not because of a supposed energy crisis, but because energy, electricity and gas in Britain is privatised. Secondly, Britain has relied too extensively on liquefied natural gas. And thirdly, the British government should have put politics aside and should have emulated the agreement which Germany reached with Russia, by which Germany will receive a constant and uninterrupted flow of natural gas, which is crucial to the German industry and crucial to German domestic households. But Peter, I want to share a story with you, Patrick, and our viewers. Recently, I embarked on a journey from London to Pembrokeshire. That is a vast distance, and I stopped at numerous places along the way. At no time did I see a food shortage. At no time did I see an energy shortage. But I took it upon myself to speak with employees at petrol stations from London to Pembrokeshire and in supermarkets from London to Pembrokeshire. Every single employee told me there is no food shortage. There is no energy shortage per se. What has caused some problems regarding items of foods in supermarkets and almost an overnight demand on petrol and diesel was panic buying.
Yeah.
What we have seen, Peter, in Britain is British mainstream media a few weeks ago put out an uncorroborated story to say that Britain was short of petrol and diesel. And the British people, again, without thinking independently, without thinking critically, having this absolute faith in what mainstream media tells them, they went out, they didn't just fill up their cars, they filled up jerry cans, they filled up plastic bin liners with petrol and diesel. And that caused a very short-term shortage. But there is no energy crisis per se in the United Kingdom. So that leads me on to discussing why is mainstream media alleging that? Why are British ministers alleging that? I believe part of the reason, Peter, is to distract the British public from some very serious changes which are being imposed in British society vis-a-vis what is known as COVID-19. And I believe it is also another way of justifying the increase in electricity and gas by saying it hasn't anything to do with privatization. It has everything to do with Russia. So I believe that there is more to this story of an energy crisis in Britain than meets the eye.
You know, Patrick, also what is I think dangerous for the average consumer is that in a way this narrative can be turned into see how incompetent carbon fuel is. You know, we have to make that final vault, okay, over to the green economy here, which of course for the people that subscribe to that might be all nice and fine. Maybe they have solar panels already, but I mean, there's more time and effort being put into 2024, 2034, 2044. What about this winter? Okay, these are incompetent people. They think about unicorns all of the time, and the rest of us pay the price for it. Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah. So when there is a spike in wholesale prices, it hurts the retail providers of energy. So this has knocked out all of the smaller providers, the ones the government enticed to get into the market for years. And so you're left with the big players. And if the big players can then go and complain to the government and ask for what? A bailout. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see that. And so this is a consolidation of markets. This is what we've seen since the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis globally, is really a reconsolidation of finance, of power, and the concentration of finance and power into fewer and fewer hands. And so if you look at the Great Reset directive, the book, Klaus Schwab's own book, they want to reduce air travel. They want to make fossil fuels no longer economically viable. They want to reduce consumption of beef and pork. Now we have the pork crisis in the UK as well. They don't have enough abattoir workers and butchers to kill all the pigs, so they need to slaughter the pigs. You need the cashless society. That's also an important feature. Central bank digital currencies, blockchain currencies. This is now being talked about by Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor Exchequer, and the Bank of England. More often now, so that this is seen as a fait accompli. Eliminating suburban life and moving people into more concentrated city dwellings and so forth. So, and stakeholder capitalism, putting the values of stakeholders ahead of profit. So fundamentally transforming what the free market economy or the crony capitalist economy, whichever way you want to describe it. So all of these tick all of these boxes one by one. And it's interesting how this overlaps, this defossil fuelization, deindustrialization, energy intensive UN Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. This does overlap somewhat with geopolitics, because this also sees to keep Russia out of the European market. And it's funny that the U.S. and Britain are egging on EU to keep sanctions on Russia. They've been doing this for years, and Russia just became the number 2 oil and petroleum importer into the United States just in September. They just surpassed Mexico, only behind Canada now. So, I mean, where is the outrage from the Democrats, from the Biden administration?
But Patrick, I mean, let me go with Mark. I mean, where's the outrage of just the complete stupidity of their planning, and ends up having the opposite effect? Or certainly the law of unintended consequences comes into play here. I mean, there are many things that people want to, on the left, that want to tinker with, and, fine. But when it comes to energy and food, I don't want them tinkering with it here. And let me point this to Marcus. I mean, no crisis is being left wasted here, is it? Okay, everything, because I think what we have with the supply chains, or the quote unquote energy crisis and COVID, they're all commingled. They all commingle. Go ahead, Marcus.
I think it's irrefutable, Peter, that a great transformation is occurring in the West, principally in America, Canada, Australia, Britain, and in New Zealand. And it's no coincidence that they are the Anglo-Saxon countries.
Good. Okay.
Yes, no, none of it is good. And as I say, it's no coincidence that those are the Anglo-Saxon countries of the world. We know that when something happens in Britain or America, it very quickly transforms to the rest of the world. And I believe that this transformation is very, very sinister. And in fact, I would go as far to say it's a very hideous transformation. The problem is that in America and in Britain, the Democratic, Republican, Conservative, and Labour parties are 2 sides of the same coin. They are corporate parties. They act in their own interest, not in the interest of the ordinary man and woman. And they are also emboldened in that by their knowledge that the average person in America and in Britain is more interested in what is happening on their television set than what is happening in their local communities, in their societies as a large. And when you have distracted people to that extent, when you have broken down their capacity to think for themselves, you can do anything you want.
We've run out of time. I want to thank my guests in London and Plymouth. I want to thank our viewers for watching us here, RT. See you next time. Remember, crosstalk rules.